Good evening. I am the Maven of the Eventide. Welcome to Vampire Reviews. Oh, I am crucifixin' to tell you about some vampires. So, you know that old joke that's like, hey guys, what if Jesus was a vampire?
Jesus brought Lazarus back from the dead.
So Jesus made the first vampire? Maybe Jesus was the first vampire. I mean, he rose from the dead too. And he told people, hey y'all, drink my blood. It'll give you special powers.
And the usual retort is like, no, Jesus was a zombie. He's all about eating the flesh, right?
Sweet zombie Jesus.
Yeah, but Jesus' whole miraculous deal being explained away as some undead creature of the night has been a punchline long before meme culture made it the thing it is today. And back in the early 90s, a group of writer friends were joking about it when one of them, who happened to have recently dropped out of studying to become a Christian minister, got it into his head that, well, Jesus being a vampire wouldn't make sense if you were to believe that he was truly God. One of Jesus's friends being a vampire sure would help explain how he kept bringing the dead people back to life. But which friend? Well, years before Dracula 2000 delivered the twist of Judas being the first vampire, and also Dracula, this author decided upon Mary Magdalene. Yes, we all know now that Mary Magdalene wasn't actually a prostitute, and that particular popular myth was created by ancient church folk because of, misogyny. But what if instead, everyone's favorite misunderstood lady friend of Jesus was actually a blood-sucking, cursed, immortally damned vampire? Poor Mary just can't catch a break. And being that this young, aspiring author had just stepped away from pursuing Christianity as a career, who more well-versed to turn the idea into an actual fantasy horror novel? The eventual result was This Is My Blood by David Wilson, finally published in 1999 and described as his first and most important novel. It's since developed something of a cult following and has been mentioned in several Mary Magdalene reference books. The author explains the whole story of how the book came to pass in the introduction to the new 2013 edition. And in the quarter of a century since he first wrote it, he's released more than 30 other sci-fi, fantasy, and horror books, as well as established a publishing company. Most people who joke about zombie or vampire Jesus come at it from a place of irreverent atheism, and even without any fanciful connection to vampires, the historical reality of Christianity's origin story is widely debated between believers and non. But This Is My Blood doesn't just ask the question of what if we imagine Jesus' pal Mary Magdalene was a vampire, but written by a scholar of Christianity, the book does it in the context of complete and utter belief that Jesus was exactly who he's purported to be. Despite the subject being something you'd anticipate would be totally sacrilegious and offensive, I was surprised to find the whole thing is written with the utmost respect and reverence for the Christian faith. It tells the gospel story of Jesus' last couple years alive from Mary Magdalene's point of view. And if you've ever read those parts of the Christian Bible, you'll notice it sticks pretty close to the book in an effort to make it believable that the few things it does change could possibly be true. So what if Mary Magdalene were a vampire? What would that be like? Well, first of all, instead of being a person with her own life and history and relationships and stuff who becomes undead, like we see in most vampire fiction, this Mary Magdalene doesn't start off as human. The old story goes that Satan used to be an angel in heaven, but then defied God, which made him fall. And when this happened, he had this whole crew of other angelic beings who fell with him, and have ever since dwelled in hell. This novel begins with the story of Jesus in the desert, where the devil is offering him temptations to troll God. After the 3 canon temptations from the Bible, this time there's a 4th. Lucifer summons up one of his fellow fallen angel people from the pits of hell and poofs her into a sexy, sexy human woman to tempt Christ, who he assumes must be thirsting for some lady lovin'. This poor former celestial being is clueless and powerless, but suddenly like the hottest, most alluring lady the world's ever seen. But Jesus is still like, nope, not tempted. Begone, thought. So Lucifer's like, curse you! And then literally curses the former angel turned devil turned human chick and poofs her into the world's first vampire, doomed to suffer excruciating thirst unless she regularly kills people and drinks their blood, despite how repulsive it is to her lingering angelic conscience. You see, for all the thousands of years she's suffered in hell, she's wanted nothing more than to get back into heaven. And for like 12 seconds, she was human. And Jesus was there with his prophecy of saving all humanity from its sins so everyone who dies believing in him would have eternal joy in heaven. And then it's ripped away from her, and she's a damned immortal creature, doomed to walk the earth eternally. Sucks to be you. Jesus feels really bad for her, both empathetically and literally, as they are linked because she was created for him. When she suffers her terrible, terrible vampire thirst, he feels it and suffers too. He gives her the name Mary after his own mom's name, and she randomly chooses Magdalene later when one of the disciples is like, dude, we have too many Marys. How are we going to tell you all apart? After the opening scene in the desert, Jesus goes on his merry way, doing all the rest of the things he canonically does in the Bible. Meanwhile, Mary spends the next couple 100 pages mostly just watching him from afar and telling the reader what he's up to. Oh, and angsting. She does a whole lot of angsting while watching Jesus from the shadows, because being a vampire is hard. She finds out her thirst is impossible to resist. So she, being the conscientious former heavenly being she is, decides to kill a sinner if she must kill. But turns out that if she kills sinners, their souls become trapped within her mind to eternally torment her with their own angst, while their bodies reanimate as new vampires. The only way she can prevent this is to kill the innocent instead, which causes her all the more angst because she feels like she's personally insulting Jesus by doing this, and she just loves him so much that she hates having to hurt him. There's not a lot of action or interaction or dialogue in this book. The ratio of Mary's internal narration and summarization of events compared to active scenes is far out of proportion from what you'd expect to see in most contemporary horror fantasy novels. This stylistic choice did make it feel more Bible-y, I suppose. The scenes where Vampire Mary actually gets to be involved in anything or even talk to someone are certainly the most engaging parts of the book, but so few and far between. But you could say that this style works thematically, because one thing that's excruciatingly emphasized is the sheer and utter loneliness of the vampire. As a vampire, Mary is reduced to an observer, always apart from humanity. Her solitude is part of her curse. Even when she was in hell, she at least had her fellow fallen angel people to suffer alongside her. But as a vampire, there is absolutely no one who understands her. Except for, perhaps, all the lonely souls out there who might be reading a book like this. Through this vampire, we have a metaphor for the loneliness and lack of human connection many people secretly feel and perhaps are too ashamed to admit. Just, heightened to an extreme bloodthirsty degree. And then, on the page, her loneliness is directly compared to Jesus's. Like her, he is #different and cannot truly connect to humanity. So even though she is damned and he is holy, they are not so different, you and I. He has his disciples, but none of them truly understand him. They want to believe he's the Son of God and all, but Mary knows he is, because she's from heaven originally too. She's the only one who actually 100% knows everything Jesus says is real, and therefore her love and devotion to Jesus is depicted as a level above the human disciples. The only person that truly gets Jesus is a vampire. And if that isn't saying something about the human condition, more than that though, the vampire is used as a way to explore religious belief. The author mentions in the book's introduction that he parted ways with Christianity due to his disillusionment with the spirituality of men, that Christians could maintain that if they simply said, "Yes, I believe in Jesus," they would get a free ticket into heaven despite perhaps not being good people. And we see Mary share this disappointment in humanity. None of the disciples live up to her standards of faith and love for Jesus, which she is uniquely able to feel because of her vampire nature. But on the flip side of all this holier-than-thou ideology, Mary acknowledges that the supernatural factors that give her this ability are completely beyond her control. "My nature was to do evil," she says. "As one of the fallen, and as part of the very creation of evil, my nature condemned me." And Jesus explains that her vampireness is part of the darkness that is necessary in order for his light to shine. Evil is part of God's plan because without it, goodness wouldn't mean anything. Mary is completely enslaved to her vampire nature, doomed to either kill innocents or create more vampires, and there's nothing she can do about it but suffer through it. The way her vampirism works robs her of her agency, and this is a commentary on the religious dilemma of the divine plan. Mary doesn't know if her vampire existence is part of God's plan all along, providing Jesus some darkness so that he can do his shining light thing, or if Lucifer really did throw a wrench into God's plan by creating her. But either way, her fate is in the hands of a higher power, and she suffers an unfair creation she never asked to be thrust into. The conclusion she comes to between this and her disappointment in the way humans are reacting to Jesus is that people need to look into themselves for power and strength, rather than relying on God for signs and miracles. Christ would never carry them to heaven, she says. The burden was their own. What he taught them was the way to achieve this on their own through their faith and love. What they saw was a king leading them, as kings always led, and all they knew was to follow. He would have made them all kings if they had listened. Her insatiable, unending vampire hunger is paralleled to the human's hunger for what Jesus has to offer. She observes the people draining Jesus dry the same way she drains her victims, never being satisfied. They see him as this endless supply of light and hope and power and wisdom, but he weakens and needs to recover. When he goes off to pray, Mary witnesses him literally pulling down magical energy from heaven to refuel himself. The disciples' need is this bottomless pit that Jesus is perpetually throwing his spirit into. This book presents a rather unflattering view of the 12 disciples in general, besides their faith and devotion not being as pure as Mary's. Because she has mind-reading powers, she knows that they keep thinking of how they can best one another, to be more favored by Jesus, so that they can share his power. They're described as plotting and skulking. And in this novel, Peter, Jesus' canon bestie, especially wants to outshine the others. His first thought was of himself and his own gain, mind-reading Mary tells us, not that of his Lord or salvation. He would not have admitted this even to himself. Judas, on the other hand, is shown as being the one disciple who's trying the hardest. Not perfect by Mary's standards, but definitely her favorite and the most sympathetic. The author admits in the introduction that he wanted to make Judas something of a hero because he always thought Judas got a raw deal. But instead of simply dispelling the myth of Judas being merely a money-hungry traitor and focusing on how Judas sold out Jesus to the priests because he wanted to push Jesus to react like the God he knew he was and display his powers, this book has Judas not be the betrayer at all. Nope, Judas was framed and is completely innocent here. And who framed him? Peter, of course. This book really doesn't like Peter. He's the traitor this time, but he doesn't do it on purpose. No, he's a jerk for framing Judas, but it's not Peter's fault he actually betrayed Jesus. Because, see, he briefly gets possessed by a demon, and that demon makes him do it.
And she tells him, I didn't want to buy this dress. The devil made me buy this dress.
Nothing is really anyone's fault in this story, what with all the demon possessions that cause most of the drama. Just like it's not Mary's fault, she's a vampire, and she can't control her vampire urges. She feels enough guilt for them, but it's still something caused by outside forces. Taking the responsibility off the shoulders of the characters and having all their wrongdoings be blamed on demons or whatever makes for a much less interesting story than characters with agency making bad choices. But perhaps this is all meant to be a commentary on how life is just not interesting if you believe it's all part of a divine plan. Because Jesus blames himself for Mary's existence, he turns Mary human. And she finally has a chance to get back into heaven along with all of humanity once he'll go and do his Jesus resurrection thing. However, at the end of the book, she finds out that in order for him to rise from the dead, she has to turn back into a vampire. She has to accept being damned in order to save the rest of the world. Now, this is framed as a choice, and even though it's nice that she gets a bit of agency finally, there's really no choice in it at all, because if she doesn't do it, then Jesus won't rise from the dead and nobody will get salvation. So, of course, she makes the sacrifice and becomes a vampire again. Her sacrifice is presented as even greater than Jesus dying on the cross, because he gets to go to heaven now and she is cursed eternally, or at least until the heat death of the universe. Poor vampire Mary, trapped in such a paradox, just like the humans and their inability to grasp true faith. When all the people are tormenting Jesus on the day of his crucifixion, Mary says, there was no humanity in what they did, and nothing but humanity in it at the same time. They were the chosen of the All-Father. They were destined for forgiveness, for glory beyond their comprehension, and yet they were beneath it. Oof, tell us how you really feel. This Mary Magdalene offers a different perspective on vampires. She wasn't human to start with, so she was already immortal, but she was damned. Becoming a vampire binds her to the mortal world, which is just a stepping stone to heaven, and therefore seems to offer her a chance at salvation, a fresh start. But it's really, really hard. Fresh starts are hard. Salvation is hard. It has to be earned. There are no free tickets into heaven. The inescapable, utterly unfair vampiric torment Mary suffers is representative of the human condition in general that people need saving from. But as Mary concludes, when Jesus tries and fails to save her from being a vampire, Jesus likewise cannot do the hard work of salvation for humanity. The lesson of the vampire here is that the only way to reach that eternal reward is for people to look within for the strength and goodness to save themselves. I'm the Maven of the Eventide, and whether you worship a biblical figure or tragic, angsty creatures of the night, the message is the same. Don't be a dick.
He scares me so. I want him so. I love him so.
Before any of you Christianity experts come at my comment section here with your thoughts on who Mary Magdalene really was, I recommend instead taking it up with the article from Smithsonian Magazine that I've linked in the description. You know, actual historians. Thank you, as always, to my Patreon patrons for making vampire reviews possible. This review was sponsored by one of my Patreon patrons who chose this book for me to make a vampire review out of. If you would like to help me make more vampire reviews, please consider joining my Patreon. If you can't do that, please leave me comments, tell me your vampire thoughts, please subscribe to my channel, and like, and I guess that's everything. Like, comment, subscribe, Patreon. Good night.